What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Healthcare Hustle Podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Christopher Fan, Director of Language Services at BJC HealthCare in St. Louis, Missouri. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Humble to be invited to join.
Of course, absolutely. So, we start every conversation off with the same question to our guest, which is, what was life like growing up for you?
Yeah, so that's it. Even when you even gave me that pre-question, it was kind of hard to to answer in a really specific way. But I'll give you kind of pieces of my life that I remember very distinctly. So I grew up probably predominantly in the East Coast, on the border of upstate New York and northern Pennsylvania. So if you guys know where Watkins Glen or Ithaca, New York is, that's kind of the counties that I got to be around. Um, Life growing up, the two things that I would say are the most important, kind of most things that I think about as identity forming for me was first, number one, being a child of immigrant parents. My parents are immigrants from Taiwan. They came in the 70s when they were obtaining master's degrees and PhDs in kind of the STEM fields. So growing up with a very real mindset of what it means to be Taiwanese.
Mm,
Um, but then on the flip side, I grew up in a town where my family was the only Asian American family in my small town. So,
mm,
you know, life growing up was really interesting in the sense of when I was home, there was an expectation of the culture that I lived out. And then the moment I left the four walls of my house, there was a completely different culture I had to live.
mm,
So if there was ever a conversation around code switching that you've had on the healthcare hustle, and no matter in what capacity, that was something that I had to learn very quickly.
mm.
The other thing that I think is very real, and I wonder how many people who are listening to this can relate to it, especially for small town or rural individuals, is the idea of growing up in a community where everyone knew who you were. And on probably any day of the week, they would be willing to give you the jacket off their back. They would be willing to give you a
Mm,
ride at any point in time. But in November, when there was an election, they would easily vote against your own rights.
mm.
And I say
Wow.
that as a person of color. So it was one of those very interesting moments of I knew the people, they knew me, they knew my family.
Yeah.
But politically, when you go to that election, I knew what they were going to vote for, and it was in direct contest to my own civil rights and to my own needs. And
Mm.
that was just a really interesting duality to live through. So yeah, that's kind of like life growing up before I left there for college and things like that.
Wow, that's so, number one, thank you for sharing in a very succinct way, but a very raw way as well. I think a lot of us can definitely, we can relate to, the aspect of learning how to code switch very early on. And I think that, you having parents that, migrated to the United States, it also provides obviously a different lens, a different perspective. And I love you calling out, hey, people in my small town would give me the jacket off my back. But, when it came to, politics, it was a little different. Do you feel like, where you're from regarding the States and just your experiencing being here and learning all that you did growing up, do you think that that influenced your style as a leader at all?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So growing up in the States, I would say probably the most important thing I learned very quickly as an American is this idea of individualism, that it really is upon you and only you to kind of, that's the myth that is taught, right? Is that you alone hold the keys to your future and that if you try really hard, you're going to get there. Um, that shapes me as a leader. It shapes me as a person. I would say the piece that very much tempers it and challenges it every day is growing up with a East Asian expectation of your community is more important than you, and that your
Mm,
family is more important than you, and that you owe it to center your family and your community because of the knowledge of what they've done for you to position you to be successful, right? So, this idea that you are never alone and you are not alone, which is actually a positive thing, right? That your accomplishments is a direct result and a direct gift of the generations before you of trying to make places better for you. And so, like, it's a very interesting kind of duality. Once again, it's a very real duality I live through every day. So I would say as a leader, some of the things I have to challenge myself with is, am I centering myself when I make decisions, or am I centering my team, or am I centering my organization, or am I centering my community that my mission is
Wow.
asking me to think about?
Yeah. Wow. That's actually just hearing you have that duality is really interesting because I think when I like reflect on my experiences as a Black American, it's not necessarily that so much, and it is a part of so much has been done for me, but it's more of a so much is more left to do. So I have to center, others in a certain kind of way. Whereas with yours, it's so much has been given to me, and also there's still a lot that needs to be done, but this idea of removing yourself from your lens as a leader is actually really interesting. And I'm gonna put a pin in that because I want to chew on that a little bit, later down the road of our conversation.
Yeah.
So what was it, during maybe high school or even before that that really got you on this journey towards healthcare or health or just making things better for people in general?
Yeah. Yeah, so I never thought I was going into healthcare. My parents always wanted me to be a doctor, and you can insert any stereotypical hilarious conversation in that one. But they really just, they wanted me to be a doctor, not really much, really because they really wanted me to make an impact in the world. I never really wanted to. I aspired to go into the American Foreign Service my whole life. That's all I
Mhm.
wanted to do. I wanted to be an ambassador. I wanted to work across the world trying to connect people um, that are diverse in ways that join them together, and kind of this idea of how do you really make people understand one another in a way that you don't have to change them, but you just honor them. Thought I was going to go to the foreign service. It didn't work out the way I wanted to. So after college, I went to South Africa for a summer. Ironically, and well timed. I went during the World Cup, so that was great.
Yeah.
But really, I was there for 3 months, and what I was doing was I thought I was going to help young Black families who lost one or both of their parents to HIV/AIDS. I thought I was just going to help them with
Mm,
English. Just this
mm,
idea of how do you get them to be used to speaking English, and kind of an ESL thing. And very quickly, what I learned, especially because I worked not in Cape Town, but I worked in the townships of Cape Town, where if anyone
mhm,
knows about kind of any country other than the Western world, the moment you go into the suburbs, that's where the poverty hits. And that's where a
yeah.
lot of, I would say, Black South Africans live, as opposed to kind of the white and the mixed groups of South
Mhm,
Africa. And what I found out really fast was it wasn't my job to, to get people to do ESL. It was my job to give them real life skills to matriculate through high school and eventually go to college, because
wow,
what they weren't given was opportunity. And what they faced every day were intentional policies at the local, state, and national level that wanted them to fail,
yeah.
that kind of tried to predetermine their failure. So then at all times there could be kind of this idea that you would never succeed, but somehow it'd still be your fault.
Mm,
Um,
wow,
and so with that, when I came back to the States, that kind of opened my eyes to the idea of, whether the foreign service or whether anything I wanted to do, one of the biggest things that were the barriers to someone's success was their health. And not
mm,
so much the choices they could make for their own health, but what were the pieces literally built around them, that where that decision may not even be in their own hands,
yeah.
that they may not be in position to make a good choice to be healthy, or to thrive in a way where all the other parts of their lives could actually fall into place, right? So if you lose your mother to HIV/AIDS at 12, and then you lose your father to HIV/AIDS at 15, I mean, at what point is college a conversation for you,
Yeah.
right? Like at that point, that's survival,
Right.
and that's not just survival for you. That you probably have a sibling, and how do you help them survive? So just the idea of health was really something that opened my eyes, and so at that point, um, I decided to go to WashU for a social work and a public health master's degree, so dual degrees, with the idea that I was going to try to marry the two skill sets of understanding population health and population health change with the skill set of social work. And that's, how do you actually get to know people, and how do you empower people to make the best choices for themselves, or how do you empower communities to make those choices, right? So instead of dictating to them what is the best choice, how do you give them the resources to ultimately make the best choice for who they are and what they need in that moment? So kind of how I fell into healthcare as a career.
Wow. Number one, what a story. And I don't know how many folks actually, travel to another country, see things, come back, but have a lens that necessarily isn't your own. Like it's not like you're a Black South African, right? That like went over there like to do mission work, but to be able to come back and still apply what you learned to communities in the United States, I think is incredible. And another thing that made me think when you were talking is, man, when did Chris develop this lens for policy and understanding that, hey, there's stuff happening above people's heads or at a level that the average citizen, average global citizen may not know about, but directly impacts them. I think a lot of people in this day and age still struggle with that, even though we're all more aware of historical things that happen and how certain inequities are still perpetuated. But where did that start for you? Like, how did you develop that mindset to look at the world that way?
Yeah, so that's wow, that's a great question. That's really hard. Maybe I'll give you a personal story and then an academic story. So personal story, what made me really understand, kind of get the sense of it, was just my parents' struggle with kind of telling me what the difference is between being Taiwanese and Chinese, right? We speak the
Mm-hmm.
same language. Ultimately, historically, you go back far enough in the generations, we're all dynastically from the same grouping of people.
Yeah.
But my parents really tried to instill in me the difference between what it means to be proud to be Taiwanese versus proud to be Chinese, right? So there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
politics, a lot of civil war, Chinese civil war related things. My dad is indigenous. My dad's family is indigenous to the Taiwan island, so his family's even opinions about the nationalists of China were drastically different than my mother's, who were part of the people who fled communist China to Taiwan. So personally, I already started to get a sense of like, wow, politically and at a very high level, my identity is being shaped pretty quickly. Academically, when I went to Michigan State, because I really wanted to go into the foreign service and things like that, I majored in identity politics. Basically, it's called comparative cultures and policy. But really, what we were focused on was how do individual and community identities shape political process and
Mm-hmm.
policy change. But then in the reverse, how do policies and the real world forcibly change your identities?
Wow.
So I studied kind of identity formations post genocide, so
Mm-hmm.
looking at what happened to the Khmer Rouge, what happened to survivors of the Holocaust, and things like that,
Wow.
and seeing how your identity is not always shaped by your own thoughts, but literally by what has happened to your community, what has happened to your family, and then subsequently what policies were created to then help shape your identity. And then another way as a millennial, and I'll claim that and be happy about being a millennial, is one of the biggest identity formations was Columbine.
Mm.
One of
Right.
those moments where um, what it was like to be locked down in a school and hide, and being taught at a very young age to be afraid that at any point someone you may know very well is going to come in armed and shoot you.
Yeah.
um, that's a very real generational identity formation.
Yeah.
And so it's not because of your own experience. I wasn't in Colorado when it happened. um, but the idea of what policies happened or did not happen after that very
Right.
quickly shapes my identity of and what I and how and what I feel about certain topics. Right. So, you
Yeah.
know, it's just, that's kind of how I figured it out. I mean, I would say that it probably was given to me by my parents, because my parents had to struggle with their own identities of what does it mean to leave everything to come to a country that is going to force you to redefine who you are. And so I got to feel it. And then, as any generation or any person, there are real moments in your life that if you're willing to learn from it, you'll really much understand that's when your identity shifted somewhere.
Wow. Dang. I think that is, again, I'm just, reflecting in real time as you're speaking. I'm just thinking about the different generational events that have happened to different cohorts of people. At this point in time, those cohorts having different generations within them, and then something of healthcare and COVID, for example, and like
Yep.
how really COVID would influence my identity as a younger millennial, older Gen Zer healthcare professional now,
Mhm.
right? And like the attitudes that I have towards certain things. And so, but I've never really thought about, you know, that collective event. What is that collective piece? Personally, I've thought about it. We've talked about this before, but
Yep.
just professionally or just how I'm actually interacting with the rest of society. I've never thought about it like that. And I think that it would be cool if more people had that approach. And I want to directly pivot into something super specific now
Mhm.
as it relates to your role and what you've been doing in healthcare for the last few years. So we hear identity is a critical piece. We hear that the policy piece is an important kind of knowledge base that you have. So can you talk to some of the listeners about language services, your
Yeah.
journey through language services in healthcare, and why language services is important when it comes to a person's health in general?
Yeah. Yeah. So, so I didn't start at Barnes Jewish Hospital or BJC HealthCare in language services per se. I actually started as an education development coordinator for the Center for Diversity and Cultural Competence. So my role, along with my leader, was to basically develop training and education opportunities to kind of talk about the need to understand how diverse healthcare is and actually rendering healthcare to others. But also just the sheer fact that healthcare, like every other organization and every other profession, is deeply inequitable, right? And those were with intentional and unintentional decisions from policies to practices to programs and to people, right? We know that there were many decisions made across all of those functions that created a health system where we still have deep inequities. um, so as I went through there was the leader of language services at the time at Barnes Jewish Hospital had left, and our leader, Dr. Stephen Player, gave me the opportunity to help him and help our department kind of step through that. And so, one of the things that immediately came to my mind when I was asked that was just my own family's experience in healthcare.
Mm,
So granted, my parents are PhDs, right? So in
okay.
no way, shape, or form can you not consider them very, very smart, intelligent people.
Right.
Um, but the very fact that they have an accent, or the very fact that their knowledge of healthcare in English might be limited, the experiences they received in that small town in the hospital was really interesting, right? So
Mm,
they were treated as if they didn't know anything. They were treated if they didn't know what like blood pressure was, or they didn't, or
wow.
people would even just ignore answering questions because they just didn't want to answer a question in a way with someone who had an accent.
Mm,
Um, and also, this was before the Affordable Care Act, was before a lot of Joint Commission requirements, things like that. So this was where like my parents had to read everything in English. They had to receive every information in English.
wow.
So the very fact that like sometimes I had to sit with them and kind of explain as best as I could as a young person what I thought healthcare was trying to tell them, um,
Right.
and things like that, right? So all that dovetails into this idea of what language services is. So, a lot
Mm,
of people, when they hear the term language services, they're going to think of, oh, interpreters, right?
yeah.
The physical people who, help be the communicate, that help the communication bridge. And that is a major piece of it.
Hmm.
And every single person who dedicates their life as an interpreter, whether it's certified as an ASL or American Sign Language or another spoken language, they are true heroes, because what we want to talk about as language service is the idea that whether people want to admit it or not, we live in an almost English only society, and
Mm,
we judge
yeah.
people based on their capacity to understand and complete their life in English.
Yeah.
And what happens with that is, you can imagine that the one of the main barriers to your health outcomes is understanding the decisions that may be made for you, because you are not feeling empowered to make the decision for yourself.
Yeah.
So you think about how, if you are an immigrant, you are a refugee, you are deaf or hard of hearing, you are blind, right?
Yeah.
What are all the pieces of healthcare that now become close to insurmountable?
Absolutely.
As a person who learned English my entire life, there are certain pieces of healthcare I still do not understand very well. So I
Yeah.
can't even imagine when you add the layer of language. to
Right.
that.
As
And when
people
you
who
add,
work in the
yeah,
industry, there's things that we
yeah,
don't
to
know.
work in the industry or to be served by the
Yeah.
industry, I can't imagine the amount of, I wouldn't say forced, but
Mhm.
it does feel that way in some sense. The forced trust and the forced locus of control many people have to give to healthcare professionals because they just can't make that decision, right? And the amount,
Mm.
right? And so language service as a whole is a way to tackle an accessibility issue, right? We know that the number one way that people can have much better health outcomes is the idea of, can they access all the things they need to have good health?
Yeah.
A lot of people talk about food, a lot of people talk about housing, a lot of people talk about socioeconomic status, and another critical piece is language.
Yep.
Can you even understand what is happening to you or to your family member, and can you make the right decision for you? And so language services in many ways is, how do we ensure, and I'll use BJC in it, just as the example for what we say.
Mhm.
Some of our mission demands certain things, that we will give the world's best medicine to
Yeah.
people. Our tagline is saying that you deserve extraordinary care. And I always like to say, when we think about language access or language services, that mission and that tagline for us has to be unconditional, that you
Right.
deserve extraordinary care regardless of your language,
Yeah.
that we will give you best and world-class medicine regardless of your language, or maybe in celebration of the language diversity you bring, right? And so there's a lot of things that go into language access, right? We have our interpreters, we have translations, but we also have this understanding of the cultural linguistic pieces that I don't think always carry over, right? People come with different experiences in healthcare. They come with
Mhm.
different expectations of the relationships between their healthcare provider and their family or they themselves. And that is also a huge learning that we need to have in the United States, especially for those who've grown up most of their lives not having to interact with immigrants, refugees, the deaf, or the blind communities.
Yeah. So thank you for that response. And you actually answered follow-up, which was going to be what are the biggest challenges regarding providing culturally confident care in terms of language. But I think you bring up a lot of amazing points. I think number one, it's just as a person who born here, raised here, whole family's been here for as long as I know, pre or post slave trade. Like it's like for me, when you think of language, you don't necessarily think of how constrictive language can
Mhm.
be. We have on the health equity side, it's like, well, we want to make sure the literacy levels for everything we're putting out as a health system is at least at a fifth grade reading level so we can have, patients understand it if they're coming
Mhm.
from XYZ community. But it's like that same kind of thinking really does go to individuals who also don't speak English, like just
Yeah.
straight up. And I think that at times we forget how much in the moment, whether it's that, provider to patient interaction and it's a 20-minute exchange, or whether it is the administrator that they're never going to see, whether it's the registration person checking them in, how much power and influence and control we actually have over somebody's
Mhm.
lives in those
Yes.
small moments, right? Like you don't even think it's easy just to forget that, like how much impact we actually can make on people's lives from behind a screen, right?
Yeah.
And so it's actually it's a good thing to know, but I can imagine it's a little overwhelming, for some
Mhm.
people that are listening, because it's like, oh wow, like there's a lot that I have to consider actually before I step into the shoes as a healthcare administrator or provider or
Mhm.
whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say probably a low risk way to think about it, how it may have happened in someone's life already is, for all the people who maybe traveled on vacation overseas or in a place that is not as English speaking. So there's places in the United States where that you can go into communities where English is not a dominant language. So if any of you had that experience, right, I would probably give the example of, like, imagine you were overseas on vacation, and I just want you to think about the amount of power all the people just the
Mm,
service people had over you because they had a mastery of their language. So whatever you said, they could make the determination of how they were going to serve you, right?
yeah,
Whether it was the food you ordered, the drinks you wanted, the directions you were asking for. I mean, that's pretty low risk, right? Like you try to order orange juice and they bring you apple juice, right? Like there's not like the
yeah,
risk of what's going to happen to you is probably pretty slim. But imagine flipping that into, you have a congenital heart issue.
mm,
And I always try to ask people, think about it, man, if you were in Taiwan, where my family's from,
wow,
and the only thing you heard was Chinese every step of the way, just how little do you feel in your own decision making?
yeah,
From the very beginning, the moment where you're like, I need to get a taxi or I need to get a car to get to the hospital, right? Every step of the way, there is someone who says, I own almost absolute power over your own decision making, where whatever you tell me, I can dictate through my own language and cultural lenses how I'm going to actually serve you. And
yeah,
so, right, you can imagine when it is high stakes,
yeah,
when it is very high stakes, and I would say anything in healthcare is pretty high stakes for a patient or their family members. It's just a good reminder of like how much do you want people to give you culturally competent, or I would just say just even basic compassionate care if you broke
mm,
your arm in a country
yeah,
that didn't speak English, right? Just the amount of people you pray and hope would be willing to try to involve you in your own decisions, and we give you the time to do that, right? Are we doing that in our own healthcare systems? And I would say, mixed at best, I would say.
yeah. It's interesting because that is such a it's crazy. It's really crazy that you put it that way. I think that it really it gives me a renewed appreciation, and you said compassionate care, but culturally competent as well. Because beyond like imagine the service, like the level of service that you would want in another country, just imagine the goodwill that you would hope
Mhm.
people were to
Yeah.
have. Like if they saw that, like you would want someone to stop and try to comfort you in some kind of way. Like it's just like it puts a different level of attention towards like detail in terms of how we have to be, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that this mentality, you know, just applied to everyone, not even individuals that speak another language, like would take us so much further. And so I want to come back to something I said I was going to put a pin in, which is
Yeah.
just your identity, right? And that influencing you as a leader, right? The lens that your parents helped you develop and appreciate just because of their background in a very real situation, um, that is Taiwan China relations. Do you feel like you've been able to be impactful as a leader, and with all of this, do you feel like you are moving towards kind of what you set out for yourself at the beginning of this all?
You know, I think the appropriate answer is always going to be yes, right? You always want to feel like you're making great impact and you're moving needles across the board. I will honestly say it's probably mixed.
Mm,
There are probably places where I feel like, yeah, I think I've made an impact. I think if nothing else, have influenced other people to maybe think strategically or maybe think more mindfully about some of the choices we're making. I hope if we can define impact by
mm,
allowing someone to broaden perspective or to take a pause before they make a decision, then okay, I can say that I've probably made some impact. Um, when I think about some of the big things that I am deeply passionate about, and right, that's policy change, cultural transformation work, liberation of um of traumatized communities, both historically and presently. Like, did I make an impact? I'm not sure. I'm just not
mm,
sure yet. I mean, I'm so young in my career, and I also know that it is lifetime and beyond lifetime work to do that. You know, if I look through the lens of my family,
mhm,
or just the idea that I am a young Asian American man who is charting probably a slightly parallel but not similar path that many Asian American may be seeing themselves. I hope I'm making an impact. I hope I'm showing that there are different ways you can make impact. There are different ways that you can change things, and perhaps, and maybe introspectively, maybe the most important thing is how I'm impacting myself. and
Mm,
how I'm doing my own work
wow.
on how I need to be, in the sense of how I need to position myself personally, professionally, um, in the way of how am I serving those next generations? Because at the end of the day, right, and this is not distinctly from my culture. I'm actually thinking about a dear friend who taught me a lot about Native American indigenous cultures, about this idea of N7. So the idea of 7 generations ahead. Are the decisions you're making right now going to make a positive impact for the next 7 generations of the people that you hope are being benefited, right? And so, you know, does that impact happen? Yeah, that I'm definitely seeing the impact of as a leader, as I'm understanding more and more of the curtains being drawn back, right, from like the Wizard of Oz idea of the just the realization of kind of how many things are connected, how many decisions that are made, and also just the moments where you are demanded to to decide if you're going to make a courageous decision, and the times that those are either taken or not taken, yeah, the impact on me has been tremendous. But looking outwardly, whether it's humility or just, I need to hear other people tell me, have I made a big impact? I would say in some places, and then other places, I would say that it's still a long road before I could even make a judgment on that.
I feel that. I want all of the listeners to take away something that you said, which is really turning it to the introspective level and really asking yourself, have you made an impact on yourself? Because I think that that's one of the first things I typically get when people reach out to me if they're pursuing a fellowship or if they're getting their first job out of a MSW or MPH program. It's always like, do you feel impactful? Do you feel like you're actually making change? Are you making a difference? And I think it is really easy to get lost in that, particularly at every stage of your career, early on, midway through, even when you get to whatever, the height of your career is supposed to be. I think for what I will brand us as social justice warriors, I think that that's what we care about the most. Obviously, like, are we genuinely moving the needle? And so can you describe just, you know what your journey has been like? Because you mentioned that you're young, you're director, still under the age of 40, and a father as well. So can you mention just what has this journey been like for you, specifically being a person that has this change agent mentality, being someone that came in the door with this lens of understanding history, policy, culture, and the impact on health, and then having to go into a healthcare system in which many people do not have that framework. How has your journey been navigating that space?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess what's difficult, because it's going to sound really philosophical, and I apologize for it. I have always walked into my roles, regardless of what they were, as the idea of I hold a set of skills that I have learned and that I've honed, right? This is something that I have learned from many mentors, many teachers, many friends, and even many adversaries, right? You learn
Mm,
many great lessons from adversaries. And while I have all these skills, it is not ultimately about me.
mm,
It is about the communities that I have determined or that I have chosen as what deeply drives my mission, right?
yeah,
And so, I gave the story about South Africa. At the end of the day, I'm not sitting in these decision-making rooms or in the room as just someone who's trying to give advice, thinking like, oh, what's my next career jump? Or how do I look real good and say, the great thing in the moment so then everyone remembers who said it and how they said it. It is about in that very moment when I hold some level of power or some level of voice because I got to be in the room, right? And I think that's one of the most important things about is if you want to make change, you have to be in the room, right?
right.
That's just what you have to understand. But when you're in the room, it's um, the communities that are the most needing of a voice oftentimes are never allowed in those rooms. And that is an intentional choice that
Right.
those voices are not allowed in the room. So when you have a set of skills and you know what your mission is, right? Your own personal mission, and hopefully it aligns with the mission that you are at least going to carve out inside the organization you are a part of. It's what are you going to do for those communities, right? As an Asian American, I think about all the time, not of the very well placed Asian Americans who, rightly so, have done very well. Their families have done remarkably well given the amount of other pieces that have been against them,
Yeah.
historically and politically and things like that. But I also center the idea of like, there's not that many Southeast Asians who have a voice anywhere
Mm,
in any of the choices they make. And I'm not Southeast Asian. But what
right.
I can understand is I understand what it's like to not have a voice. I understand what it's like to have my parents never have a voice in their own decision making. And so, you know, to be a young careerist, what I've always thought about is, you know, the people the relationships that you cultivate, right? And that is an intentional thing. You have to cultivate relationships. You have to decide which relationships you want. You have to determine who you want as mentors. You have to determine who you want as your kind of your collective group of people who will be your critics, your co-creators, your confidants, and things like that. That's going to be the ultimate power you actually have, because at the end of the day, if you get the role you want and you are C and it starts with the word C in there somewhere, great. And you're going to make decisions. Um, and on the road to get there, I mean, I think what I've learned the most as a young professional, and I hope other young professionals are learning this. Maybe they're being taught otherwise, but I hope there's a part of them that still remembers this, is that you don't get very far by yourself.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, getting really far, but not seeing your own colleagues getting anywhere doesn't feel great.
Mm,
And I'll be honest, it doesn't feel great for me.
yeah.
Um, and then the other part to your question, of just how you do this work, I think you also have to be very, very honest with what your priorities are for
Mm,
yourself.
yeah.
So like Winston said, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a young careerist, I'm a director, right? I'm all these things. And at the end of the day, I need to make the decision of just how do I prioritize those in my life? And at the end of the day, what do I want to see on my tombstone? Right? Do I
Mm,
want to see on my tombstone like, oh man, this is a cutthroat director who, made the choices that like X, Y, and Z, right? Is that
yeah.
how I ultimately want to be written down and how my family talks about me? Or is it this person gave everything he could to do the best and the right thing for the people that he held dear in his heart, right? Like
Yeah.
those are those choices you make, right? And every day you get to make that choice differently, right? And so some days you may have to choose the cutthroat thing, knowing that at the end of the day, that last choice you're going to make is for your family or for the communities you serve. So, not sure if that answers your question, but I'm young in my career. I've gotten very far pretty fast. I'm not going to lie about that. And what I'll also say is that that has everything to do with your willingness to learn, your willingness to seek out the people who want to see you succeed. And it's also about being able to own your truth,
Mhm.
but do it in a way that people see the the passion you have as opposed to um
Frustration or
the
anger
frustration you
or
have, yeah, in
mm,
what you want to see.
I love that. That's such an important distinction because I think, and for everyone that's listening, Chris has been a colleague of mine since I started my fellowship. But you were very instrumental in providing me a model on how to channel that energy, right? Because I think that we all, as graduate students, as undergraduate students, even as early careers that may not be in the position that we want to be in just yet, we see the inequities, we see the cracks and the faults in the structure in the system, and we're just so energized to do something about it. We could talk before we get the position. We could talk to anybody for 10 hours about all the things that we would do if we had the position, if we had the title.
Yeah.
Then you get in and you recognize, like, oh, okay, in order to make all of this work, I have to actually play the game to an extent. And I have to play the game well if I really want to be successful at moving the barriers, at creating more access, at eliminating some of these inequities. And it could just be a challenge. I think it can really just be a challenge if you don't have individuals who have done it successfully coming before you. And one of the things that you said to me that I think that you've always done a great job at is wanting to see people succeed, right? And I think that is probably the biggest thing that I would want to reinforce for anybody, any health equity champion, any, social justice warrior, anybody that's out there listening that really, has a burning passion inside them to do something, is it's about connecting with those like-minded individuals that, can continue to add that development, but also help you navigate, some of the things that you're going to encounter, right? Because and I'll pivot again gently, but I know that there are some things that we won't get into specifically, just regarding this current climate in healthcare,
Yeah.
that you are still having to kind of knock down, some barriers and some walls. And so, without getting too specific, just thinking about where we are with the intersection between the LGBTQIA community and
Yeah.
healthcare, right? And you have done things at the local level at our organization to really get us up to speed. And so I would love it if you could kind of, maybe just describe what that process, what that journey was like for you. But then also, after being successful on getting, a few of our hospitals a special designation for the LGBTQIA community or targeted towards that community, having to kind of still appreciate, like, hey, everything takes time. So
Yep.
maybe, this was getting this HEI status was a certain win, but now really taking it a step further is going to take even more time. How do you process that, right? And how do
Yeah.
you deal with that?
Yeah. No, that's real. I mean, it's a really good way to walk through a tangible thing that I've been blessed to have been a part of, but also talk about how you understand goal setting and how you actually understand impact and how you understand how you don't burn yourself out because you're like, man, in 5 years I didn't transform the United States, right? Like it's one of those moments where you just have to kind of humble yourself a little bit. So, first and foremost, as a full disclosure, I identify as a cisgender heterosexual man. So, when we talk about the LGBTQIA community, I understand that I'm not part of that community, and that my definition and that my identity as an allyship rests solely on the LGBTQIA community to define that on my behalf and whether they accept me as such. Um, but to the point of the Human Rights Campaign's Health Equality Index, which is something that healthcare across the board can participate in, one of the things very early in my career that I noticed was just something that we didn't talk about a lot. There wasn't a lot of conversation about the health outcomes for the LGBTQIA community, but the research was there. The qualitative data was there, right? We knew that there were people who identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and the full spectrum of sexual orientation, whose health outcomes were drastically worse, right? And then when you add the intersectional identities of race, and gender and things like that, then it just got even more appalling. You then add on to gender identity and the wonderful and beautiful spectrum of gender identity, right? Just every health outcome just basically showed you that if you were a sexual minority or a gender minority, your outcome was just going to be horrific for the most part. And then you hear stories, right, from friends, from colleagues about what it's like to be refused your partner's name on a birth certificate
Mm,
because you're both women,
wow.
or what it's like to be what it's like to literally be told to your face that you won't be taken care of by a provider, right? Because you identify as a way that just was not okay with that person, right? And then you start seeing, and I would say you start seeing yourself in that, right? You start seeing yourself in, man, like I
Yep.
know moments in my life where I wouldn't have been served, or historically where, as an Asian American, I was never even considered a citizen, right? There was no possible way under Supreme
Yep.
Court ruling I could have been allowed to be a citizen, right? Or, the person I chose to marry was not legal like 70 years ago, right? And
Yep.
so, you draw these connections of empathy and
Mm,
trauma, and so what you do is you set a goal of, whether or not we're going to reach a designation or things like that, what we're going to do is we're going to find connections with people.
yep.
That's the most important thing, is
Mm,
trying to just create the connections of saying, like, I can't promise you certain things. The one thing I can promise is that I want to be here for you.
yeah.
And how can I do that? Right? How can I either create space on your behalf? How can I maintain space on your behalf? How do I fill space on your behalf depending on the needs that you have? And how do you understand the stories? How do you understand your own connection to that story? And then ultimately how you think about what ultimately is a designation, right? A designation is something where people can get proud of the things you do, but really what it is that it's your commitment to
Yeah.
centering people that have never been centered in
Right.
history,
Right.
right? And so an HEI designation, great. It's great if you are a top performer. It's great that you're a leader. It's great that you participate in it. But what it really wants to show is how often do you center a couple of identities that historically in healthcare have never been centered?
Yeah.
And being able to say that we want that community to feel like they actually belong here and that they'll actually be treated as such, that they deserve that. So when we think about like the hardships that come with that, is just, you know, no matter what I feel or what I believe, people aren't ready. Not everyone's ready to hear that. Not everyone's ready to make those changes, right? That goes back to the courage and
Yeah.
the willingness and the other factors that go into place. Um, and when I define courage, I mean not saying that you have to make a big, massive decision tomorrow, but you have to have the courage of understanding there's, you know, are there factors involved that are going to create additional risk? And do you have the courage to accept such risk, right? So,
Mm,
you think about people, you think about the people before certain civil rights legislation. They had to make really courageous moments, right? It's great
absolutely.
when people say, like, I totally would have been someone who marched on Washington. I'm like, yeah, you probably wouldn't have.
Right.
Or like, I totally would have participated in the Underground Railroad. I'm like, I doubt that. I really highly doubt that at the end of the
Yeah.
day, you would have made that choice. It's the real idea of when someone looks at you in the face, or you actually know someone who identifies as such. And I'm at this point not talking about LGBTQIA. I'm talking about anyone who's a minoritized or a trauma or someone who has been traumatized by healthcare. It's looking at them and saying, "Are you willing to be courageous enough to center them over yourself?" Right? And then that's just those moments
Mm,
where, um, it's a long road. You know, I don't know a time in modern history where the LGBTQIA community had an even moment of the feeling that equality was close for them,
mm,
or that they could even be out and proud or out and alive.
yeah.
And so I also have to humble myself in the idea of like, I can't forcibly change a region right now.
Right.
It wouldn't be honest. It wouldn't be helpful, because then you'd create an additional unintentional target on the back of an already traumatized and marginalized community. It's, what can we do? What can I do? But more importantly, how do I connect? How do I connect these community voices to the things that matter? And then and this is probably where the social work and public health degrees come into great play, is how do you also align it to other people's goals, where it just becomes a thing where like you really can't say no to it if it's along the lines of what that goal is. Now it can be a personal thing where you just don't want it, or there's other factors, but the idea that like this is good for many reasons and it
Yeah.
aligns with other things, it just takes time, right? And and the way that I can relieve myself slightly or forgive myself of the frustration that I have, is just the idea that, I've only been doing this like 8 years,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Like, right, like, and I look at the people who have been doing this work their whole lives, 50,
Yeah.
60, 70 years, the people who have died not seeing certain things happen, right? Like, who am I to think that I'm better than some of the people who have died doing the work that it never got the place where they wanted, right? So I think there's
Yeah.
also this idea of reminding yourself that like we're not all going to be MLK. We're not all going to be Harvey Milk. We're not all going to be Dick Gregory, right? Like we're just not. But you
Yeah.
can do parts, and you can definitely do parts of looking at the people who are in your address book on your phone and saying, am I doing my best for that person? I hope so, right? So not sure if that helps out, but
No,
it's
that's no, that's amazing. It's that's I think it's step by step. It's chunk by chunk. And I think that there's so many things that you said, like throughout the course of this conversation, that I just hope resonates with people because, not, I think a lot of people, when we think about success, when we think about, you know, what that looks like, being a super wealthy C suite something, but also making all this transformational change. Like I think that's like the best of both worlds. The individuals like you and I are individuals that aspire to be like you. We typically go in there with this mindset. And it's funny, you mentioned Dick Gregory, Harvey Milk, the MLKs of the world. It's like there's a bunch of people that came before them,
Yep.
that were doing that laid the foundation. There were a bunch of people that were around them at the time, also doing a bunch of things, right, that we do not know of, like literally thousands of
Yep.
different figures in each fight, in each era, in each battle for equality that all played a monumental role. And one of the things that you said earlier was like, when you get that seat, it's not about saying the thing that people are going to remember in some preachy MLK tone and you feel good about it. Although there may be currency in that, right? There may be some capital that you can leverage, but it is really about centering the folks that you are there for. And I think that that's something that I also tell myself now, and I've been able to appreciate. One of our good colleagues and actually our first guest on the podcast, Andwele Jolly, I remember when he told me like, yo, anything that you're gonna do that's gonna be impactful, make change, and or be sustainable is gonna take at least 5 years to really
Yep.
like get
Hmm.
off the ground. Like this idea that you can come in, say something in the meeting, show a few graphs, and then there's just gonna be change. It's just naive. And then on top of that, not only is it going to take 5 years to really gain some traction, it'll probably take another 5 years to really be
Hmm.
implemented at a point in which you can say, okay, wow, we've really done something here. And so I think that, people may end up being the Harvey Milks, right? Of their respective fight, their respective kind of battle. But at the end of the day, we all should just try to be, the people around those people, right?
Yep.
Look, towards them for inspiration, but just continue to be around them because I think that that is a really grounding mentality that young professionals can have going forward that will make the burnout decrease significantly, right?
Hmm.
Because one thing that we didn't talk about, but we could have for ad nauseum,
Yeah.
is burnout when it
Yeah.
comes to this and having this mission because it can be really easy to go to work, see what's on paper, see your organization's values, and say, that's what we do. That's what I'm going to do. And kind of wipe your hands, clean at the end of the day. But the reality is, like, no, this takes a lot of intentional self work. And that's the biggest thing that I've actually taken from our conversation today that, this is an individual journey as much as it is you trying to be some superhero for a variety of different communities, right? It's really a journey about yourself.
Yeah, no, I love everything you said, and I think the two things that I want to take away from what you just synthesized was, first and foremost, man, no one sets out to be a superhero. You look at
Mm,
any like you look at comic
all of
books, you
them.
look at
Yep.
history. No one was like, I'm gonna be the superhero, and this is how I'm gonna do it.
Yeah.
You're a superhero because the people around you supported you, and you just, the collective got to a certain point where you were just the lucky or unlucky one who became a face of it, right? Like, and I think that's one, and I think you said that really, I think you said that beautifully in the sense of, maybe a way that you reduce burnout is you don't center yourself as the superhero. Center yourself as the hundreds of people who supported MLK, the hundreds of people the thousands of people who will never be written in history, but were pivotal in how some of these superheroes that we aspire to be actually got there, right? Like how many
Mm,
people, like joking, complete joking, like LeBron James ain't going to win championships by himself.
right. No, so that's
But not
true.
every,
That's a real
but
fact.
no one's going to write in the history book some of these players who helped him get to some of those. Like some players will be written
Absolutely.
in there, but you got to know there's a few people who, like, you give it 50 years, they're not going to know who played on LeBron James's team. But it was those athletes who understood their role,
Yep.
didn't aspire to be better than LeBron James, but said, I know what my role is, and my role is to win a championship. My role is to do this for my community, to do this for my team, and we're going to do it with that level of humility. And for many of us young people, maybe it is you go in and you understand that you are not. I mean, if you really want to be the CEO, man, you go for it.
Yeah.
But maybe for some of us, that is the level of burnout we don't want, right? We don't want to put that on our family. We don't want to put that on our own work life just
Yeah.
assessment. It's can you go in and say, I am going to, we are going to, as a collective, as a generation, right? We know that as a generation, the millennials and the Gen Zers are coming up to take over a lot of leadership positions. Is it instead of is there the idea that like I'm not going to make a decision. We are going to make that decision, right? And that's how do you
Mm,
share that? How do you share
wow.
power? How do you share burnout? Really? How do you share that level across and say we're going to do it differently? It's not
Yeah.
going to come down to one person. It's going to come down to our generation trying to figure this out and trying to do the right thing for each other. And perhaps that's a wonderful way for us to think about like that's maybe that is kind of the liberation that we're all trying to search for is that man maybe a lot of other cultures have it right that this is a
Yeah.
collective concern. This is not a me concern. This is like, yeah, we're not going to get it done in 5 years. There's no way. We're not going to liberate healthcare in 5 years. We're not going to decolonize, our community. We're not going to decolonize policy, right now. But at the end of the day, like, can I find 3 or 4 people who I'm trying to positively impact, bring them joy, bring them reprieve, listen
Yeah.
to them, help them heal? Or can I find a couple extra mentors? Not, and I don't mean like the mentors in the sense of like the people who are giving us knowledge, but I mean like lateral mentorship
Yeah.
where we're just trying to help each other. We're just trying to be that shoulder when we need to be. Maybe that is how you build and I know we've had this conversation, Winston. Perhaps some of us were a generation too early
Yeah.
in the things that we foresee as we want to accomplish. And there's nothing
Yeah.
wrong with that. But perhaps it is our role to set that next generation up. It's just easier for their decisions to come. All right.
Yeah.
And that is a very worthy goal to go for. Like imagine if every millennial and Gen Zer came together as leaders and said, this is how we lead now, and it may not transform anything in this moment, right? We're still going to fight a lot of older decisions and a lot of different cultural expectations of us.
Hmm. Hmm.
But hopefully, when Gen Alpha gets to be in these seats, completely different world.
Yeah. Wow. That's a mic drop, man. That's a mic drop. We're at time. And we typically end with kind of like, what's the best piece of advice, but I think you've given so much, and what you just said is inspirational to me. And I've always kind of thought like that, especially since I got into grad school, like, this is an us thing, and we all have to collectively really be accountable for the change that we want to see. And I think it's just a great reinforcement for myself, hopefully for our listeners as they continue to move forward. Because I think that, like you said, no one has to be a superhero. That's really not how it works. Maybe in the real world we have those aspirations, but we know what we want to see. We have to understand where we are. Obviously, do the work, show up. But I want to just say thank you for being able to give us some of your time and some of your insights on how you've been doing all of this. Because again, like I said, you're a model for me. I know you will be and continue to be, excuse me, a model for other young professionals that are coming up that have the same kind of passion. In closing, I guess I'll just ask, is there anywhere, on the internet or social media where folks, if they want to follow you, maybe have some follow up or some questions that they can have access to you?
Yeah, so like I am not very active on social media, and that's just being an older millennial. I won't even call it as an older millennial. I just didn't want to get that involved. But yeah, you can find me on Facebook, you can find me on Instagram, and you can find me on LinkedIn, right? It's just Christopher Fan. You'll find me. You'll probably see pictures of my kids, and that's probably how you'll locate me pretty quickly. But if you want to message me through any of those social media accounts, I'm more than happy to connect. I'm not. I don't have a present on X, I think is what it's called now.
Yeah.
Um, I don't TikTok. So if you want to get a hold of me, I'm pretty much that whole dial-up generation age. We kind of stopped at a certain point of technology. But yeah, you can find me, and I'm more than happy to connect with any of you.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining the Healthcare Hustle, man.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.